So in a recent video, I mentioned that I believe that every time you travel to a new and unfamiliar place, you unlock a new part of yourself, and that is why everyone should make a concerted effort to travel as much of this planet as they possibly can within this lifetime. However, one thing that I failed to mention, the other side of that process, is that as you go about unlocking new parts of yourself and accepting these parts of yourself into the scope of how you approach day-to-day life, you also have to leave another part of yourself behind to make space for that new part of yourself. And that process of leaving behind that old part of yourself can be exceedingly difficult. It often takes a lot of time and a lot of trial and error, as evidenced by what you are about to see in this video. Bearing that in mind, in this video, I'm going to be reacting to different Americans explaining the moment that they realized that America had truly messed them up, generally in the psychological sense. And at the end of the video, I'm going to mention the moment that I knew America had messed me up. It's a pretty innocent moment, so to speak, but it's something that's very telling in terms of the difference in culture between the US and the Netherlands. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this first video.
If you're an American currently living abroad, what is one time that made you realize that America really messed you up? I'll go first. I live in Warsaw, Poland now, but I always stay in touch with what's happening in the US, and I happened to hear about that Las Vegas shooting when someone opened fire on a bunch of concert goers. And it was very tragic news, but that day I also went to the movies, so I was already in a kind of weird mental state. And when I left the movies, I got on the tram again in Warsaw, and I saw this guy kind of being sketchy and acting weird in the last seat. I kept eyeing him the whole time, and he had his jacket open and he was holding something inside. He was hiding it. And I thought, my first American thought was it's a gun or a knife or some kind of weapon, and I need to move away as soon as possible. So I kept looking at him the whole ride, and then he takes it out, and it was a beer can. He was sipping it and hiding it during the tram ride. That's what happens in Poland. Not guns, not knives. And I started crying and laughing at the same time because that's when I...
So, not to cut her off right there, but that right there is one that I suspect many of these videos are going to touch on, is that fear of gun violence, that underlying fear of gun violence. You see, in Europe, a lot of times, because the cities are so much more walkable and dense, a lot of times you're going to be in these environments where in the back of your mind, if you're accustomed to seeing those stories on the news about 20, 30, 40, 50 people being shot and killed in a mass shooting, you're going to feel very, very skeptical about putting yourself in those kinds of environments, because if something were to happen in that kind of environment, all hell would break loose. It'd be a logistical nightmare just to escape, just to preserve your life. In the Las Vegas shooting that she was referring to, basically, if I'm not mistaken, I think that was the deadliest mass shooting in American history, outside of any wars or anything like that. And I want to say around 60 people died. I could be wrong about that. But over 500 people, if I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong, but it was somewhere in that ballpark of 500 plus people were injured in that shooting. So imagine in a place like really any city center in any European country, if somebody were to open fire in that kind of environment, you would just know in the back of your mind that your chance of escaping is so much slimmer because there's so many people around you. And there are probably not enough escape routes to accommodate all of those people. The fact that I'm going through this scenario in my head right now and voicing this out to you lets you know that I'm still messed up by this too. Reading all of those stories and having those mass shooting drills growing up. Yes, that's something that we did growing up. That's not a myth. We actually had mass shooter drills where they'd cover the window, they'd lock the door, and I think we would have to get on the corner of the wall opposite of the door or something like that. I don't really remember because I blocked it out. Thankfully, nothing like that actually happened in my case, but gun violence is a real threat in America, because people, for whatever reason, seem to value guns more than human life, and I will never, for the life of me, understand why that is the case. That said, let's go ahead and go on to the next video.
Just one? If this tells you anything, I was only supposed to be abroad for a year. I'm on year 10. Yeah. Essentially, what I learned was me living traveling and working around the world was easier and cheaper than me just living in the US. So why would I go back to the US to live and spend more when I can travel and live in other countries and spend less?
Exactly. Exactly. So I'm literally utilizing that exact strategy right now, filming this video in an Airbnb in Pattaya, Thailand. And you know Airbnbs tend to be marked up a little bit. I'm spending around $420, $430 per month, US dollars. So that's probably closer to 410 euros per month for this apartment. Not the biggest apartment, but it has everything we need. It's functional. And honestly, you will never find an apartment for this cheap anywhere in the US, anywhere that actually provides a livable experience. Something that a lot of Americans don't understand. They think that traveling is expensive. The reality is that getting to the place is expensive because America is so isolated. But once you get to the place, a lot of times it's cheaper to be in that place. And if you're an American, or even if you're a European who wants to broaden your horizons and go to Asia or South America or wherever else, I don't know. But if you're from the US or you're just from a country that you want to leave, the reason why you can't afford to do so is because you're trying to fund two different lifestyles. So if you're paying rent back home for an apartment that you're not even in because you're overseas, and then you're paying for an Airbnb or a flat or whatever other living accommodation you opt for, then of course you're gonna run your pockets dry. But when you cut all of those costs back home off, especially if you're from the US where you have these expensive health insurance premiums, $300, $400 a month. You have your rent, $1,200, $1,300, $1,400, $1,500 a month. You have a car back home that you might be paying off $300 a month plus interest, $350 a month. You have car insurance, $100 a month. You add all of that up, that's all money that you could use to travel. Literally, 1 month of not having rent will take you to Europe. That $1,200, $1,300, $1,400, $1,500, that'll take you most places on this planet by plane. So when you start thinking in terms of removing the costs on that side, you realize that going to Europe, going to Asia, while that's still going to be somewhat expensive, you're going to offset that initial cost by simply cutting back on the expenses on the home side. And once you get to the place in Europe, you can basically catch a train or even catch a flight to another country for less than 100 euros. I'm a witness. I have done this myself. And in Asia, it's also very similar where because you have multiple countries in close proximity, you have the benefit of being able to travel to different countries for a very low cost. So especially if you're from America, you need to understand that it is much cheaper to live overseas. It's cheaper to travel the world than it is to live in America in that apartment. I almost said crappy apartment, but I don't want to call your place crappy, but in that basic apartment that you live in Ohio or wherever you live. It's much cheaper to go and live in the Philippines or even in the Netherlands. It's cheaper to live in these places than it is to live in America. So if that doesn't inspire you to book the flight, I don't know what will. On to the next video.
My son was 5 years old the summer that we moved to Portugal. And once the school year rolled around, I took him shopping for some new clothes, some shirts, some shoes. And it reminded me of how the year before, when we lived in Texas, we had done the very same thing, except he had begged me for a pair of those really cool light up sneakers that I loved and he loved. But it broke my heart to have to tell him no, because I did not want him to become an easy target if ever there was a school shooting. And being in Portugal, shopping with him, and not having to worry about that for the first time in my life was a really big aha moment.
That's very interesting. So I'm not a parent, but I have parents. I had the light up shoes growing up because I guess back then school shootings weren't as much of a phenomenon. I think that the Sandy Hook shooting, the elementary school shooting in 2012 in Connecticut, that kind of changed the landscape of how parents viewed student safety. We already had the lockdown drills before that, but we didn't really take them seriously until that happened. Once that happened, I think that people realized that, wow, this is an actual potential possibility for our children, and we need to act accordingly. And there's actually a song called Pumped Up Kicks. I don't know if you've ever heard of the song, but basically the song talks about a school shooter or a mass shooter in general targeting people based on the shoes that they're wearing. So that's a real thing. That actually does happen, because in the event of a mass shooting, God forbid, if you ever are in one, you don't want to stand out. You don't want to be the person who stands out amongst the crowd, because they're going to aim for you first. So honestly, it's kind of crazy just knowing that my girlfriend, for example, growing up in the Netherlands, never had a lockdown drill. In fact, this blew my mind. This kind of blew my mind. So this is kind of another thing that I guess helped me realize that America had messed me up a little bit. But realizing that in the Netherlands, people could just walk into schools. They didn't need ID cards. They didn't need to check in with the office. They could just walk into schools that they didn't even attend. That blew my mind, because at my high school, we had mandatory ID cards that we had to wear every single day. And that's if you were a student there. If you're not a student there, you're not even allowed to be there unless you get an office pass and you have a very good reason for being there. So that right there, if that doesn't tell you about the difference between the perceived, and not even just perceived, but the safety, the actual safety in American schools versus European schools, I don't know what will. On to the next video.
So my first year here in Paris, I was an au pair, and I got really sick during the winter. It was bronchitis, and I couldn't breathe. I was coughing a lot. I was trying to avoid going to the emergency room as much as possible, because in the US it's very, very expensive. But there was one night where I really couldn't hold out any longer, so I drove to the emergency room. And when I was there, they gave me a nebulizer, and then they wanted to give me chest x-rays. And I was like, listen, can we please not do the chest x-rays? I'm fine, let's just go. And the doctor looked at me and she was like, why don't you want to do these? You have to do them, you could have damage. And I said, well, I don't have any money, I'm not gonna be able to afford it. And she looked at me and she was like, it's covered with Social Security. So I was like, oh, okay. And then instead of having to book a whole another appointment and wait forever for the results, we walked down the hall, we took the chest x-rays, I had the results in 5 minutes. I paid 12 euros and then I was reimbursed 3 days later.
12 euros, and she was reimbursed. It was free. The only money that she spent was the gas to get from the au pair's house to the emergency room. That's pretty crazy. I've never had a situation that was that urgent, thankfully, but I know that there are a lot of people out there who refuse to get in ambulances or refuse to go and seek medical treatment because they know that if something is wrong, they're going to be in debt. They're going to have to spend all of this money that they don't even have. And honestly, although I haven't had a situation that was that urgent, when I was younger, I think around 20 years old, I messed my back up pretty bad. Still don't know how I messed it up, probably lifting weights. But anyways, I was going to the chiropractor. I think I was paying $25 a session, something like that. Eventually, I ran out of visits on my insurance plan. Back was still messed up. So I pretty much just accepted the fact that at 20 years old, my back was shot for the rest of my life. So when I was with my ex-girlfriend, there was a day when I took her out to a museum. I took her to an art museum. We were there for around 5 to 10 minutes at most. And my back was hurting so bad that we had to leave early. And I went in the seat in my car, I reclined the seat all the way back, I turned the heat warmers on. I had just normalized this by that point. And after that, after my back started to feel a little bit better, we left, and as we were driving away, she started crying, and she told me that she was crying because she didn't like to see me in that much pain. And so that was the straw that broke the camel's back. I said, okay, you know what? Let me just go ahead and book a doctor's appointment and figure out what's wrong. $500 to $700 later, I realized that I had a herniated disc. And then add on all the physical therapy I did after that. Again, another $25 to $30 per session, something like that. That's the co-pay deductible. I don't know how all of that works. I just know I was paying them my money. I eventually, a year or two later, ended up fixing the problem. But I'm saying this to say that I was willing to put myself in a position where I couldn't even walk for more than 10 minutes at a time without literally the most excruciating pain I've ever experienced in my life, because I did not want to pay the money for an MRI, for a CAT scan, whatever all of those things were that I ended up having to pay for. I didn't want to pay the money. And honestly, it would be nice if they could reimburse me that money. That would be nice to get that money back, but I know that that's not going to happen. So I'm reimbursing myself by leaving the US and eventually moving to Europe. Right now I'm in Asia, but I reimbursed myself by booking that flight and getting up out of the US so that that doesn't happen again. On to the next video.
So I moved to the UK about 10 years ago for university, and literally my very first night there, I was fresh off the plane. It was freshers night, which is like the whole first week of university in the UK. You like go out drinking at like different bars or whatever. And we went out drinking, and this one girl that I was with got so drunk that on the way back home to our student accommodation, she was like, oh, I need to sit down. And she sat down and she just like passed out, and we could not wake her up. Like the girl was just like dead to the world, it seemed like. And immediately the people I was with was like, we need to call an ambulance. And being an American, I was like, we cannot call an ambulance. Like I had just met this girl, I had no idea if she could afford an ambulance, so I was like begging them not to call an ambulance, and they were looking at me like, do you want this person to die? Like what is wrong with you? So they called an ambulance. The ambulance came, they like checked her out, like she was, you know, alive or whatever, and they took her to the hospital. And I was like hysterical because I was like, oh my God, I've like just moved here and I've like potentially ruined this person's life by like putting them in medical debt for the next God knows how long by calling them an ambulance. And like they brought me home and they sat me down and they were like, what are you freaking out about? And I explained what I was so worried about. And they were like, ambulances are free. Hospitals are free. What is wrong with you? And like, I hadn't realized until that point that healthcare in the UK was completely free. And I still, to this day, like, get nervous every time I have to call an ambulance. But yeah, no, ambulances are free.
And you know what? There's probably going to be one contrarian in the comments who's going to say, oh, well, actually, medical care and ambulances are not free because you pay for it with your taxes. Newsflash, you pay taxes in America too. I know this because I've been paying the IRS as an entrepreneur for the past, 5 or 6 years. So I'm paying taxes. My healthcare, as I mentioned earlier, is not free. In fact, I haven't had a regular doctor's visit, a regular doctor's checkup since I was about 13 or 14 years old. That's no exaggeration. Almost half my life. So if you want to say that it's not free, then by all means, hey, you're entitled to your opinion, but facts don't care about feelings. Compared to the US, pretty much every other developed nation seems to have figured this out. And yet somehow, for whatever reason, Americans cannot wrap their heads around the idea of paying a little bit more money to ensure the well-being, or at least put the odds in the favor of their fellow citizens. I don't understand it. On to the next video.
So I'm an American living in Germany. And I remember when I first got here, my landlord was showing us our new place where we're going to be staying. And as we're on our way driving there, we're passing all these fields and open grass areas and places where they planted flowers and planted fruits and vegetables and trees, and there's just all these vast fields and hiking trails and stuff. And my landlord turns to me and says, hey, you know, you and your family will enjoy this. You know, you go out there, you can ride your bikes, you could pick fruit, you could walk all the hiking trails, you could pick the take photos and all kinds of stuff. And I was like, I looked at her and I said, my family, like people that look like us, is allowed to go out there and just, you know, nobody bothers them or nothing happens, you know, no cops are called or nothing like that. And she looked at me with like the saddest look in her eyes, and she was just like, people like you? What does that mean? And I looked at her and I'm like, people like us, black people. And she was like, I am so sorry. I'm so sorry you had to deal with that there. But here you don't have to deal with that. So yes, please enjoy all of it.
That's real right there. That's real. I'm really, really glad that I found this video right here because, look, people already know about racism in the US. I'm going to share a quick little story with you about how I was, quote unquote, racially profiled. And hey, maybe I wasn't racially profiled. I don't know. The problem is, I don't know and I'll never know. When I was about 11 years old, I was outside of my elementary school campus with one of my friends who also happened to be a young black teenager. I think he was around 12. So we weren't even teenagers yet. We were young black kids. And I think I had braids, he had kind of dreadlocks, etc. So we kind of looked the part, so to speak, if you know what I mean. And basically, we're sitting there minding our own business. I think we were leaning up on the bike racks. Maybe I'll put a picture on the screen of exactly where we were. And this police officer pulls into the parking lot. He goes out of his way to pull into the parking lot, drive up to us. He rolls down his window and he was like, "What are you guys doing?" Hello? We're 11 and 12-year-olds at a school that we both attended. It just so happens to be in the middle point of where we both live, so we're there. Of course, at 11 years old, I didn't have the ability to articulate myself to this extent. But honestly, if something like that happened to my child, I would be fucking furious. I would raise hell. I would be at the police station trying to figure out who the fuck was pressing my child like that. Because even thinking about that now, that pisses me off. And now that I think about it, the story that I have about how I knew America had messed me up is not nearly on that magnitude. But basically, I knew that America had messed me up because there was a point in time early on in my stay in the Netherlands when my girlfriend and I were riding our bikes, and because she knew the area much better than I did, she was always in front. So we came up to a roundabout and there was a car coming from the right side of the roundabout. And my girlfriend, with no hesitation, went right in front of the car. Now, mind you, I didn't know about the right of way. I didn't know that bikes had the right of way in the Netherlands. I just knew that even in the US, if we did have the right of way, I was always going to defer to the cars. Again, she had no hesitation. It's like it wasn't even a potential possibility in her mind that she might get hit. And I remember I slammed on my brakes and I was like, "Hey," I tried to call out to her, but she was already across the street. And then the car stopped and they looked at me and they gave me the little signal to go in front of them. And it's such a simple story, but I think that when you talk about the experience as a cyclist or a pedestrian, that's something that it took me a very long time to adjust to coming from America, because in the US, if you've ever tried cycling, especially in a car-centric, car-dependent place like Dallas, you know that there is no such thing as the right of way for pedestrians or cyclists. I don't care what the signs say. I don't care if you have the walk signal. I don't care about any of that. And my girlfriend found this out for herself as well. She experienced multiple times that cars will cut you off with no hesitation, even if you have the right of way. Bearing that in mind, if you are an American and you are now living abroad, what was the moment that you realized that America had truly messed you up?